Welcome back to the online version of the Global Azure Bootcamp. For the next 45 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about governance and why that's important in managing cloud. I'm Rick Hepworth, and in honour of the fact that today has been organised by some wonderful Irish friends of mine, I've decided to wear the Irish flag for my bow tie. And in my day job, I'm a consultant, and one of the things that I do is help organisations adopt Azure as their platform for applications and hosting. And we always start by talking about governance. Why? Well, the title of this session is that governance is the forgotten key to managing cloud. I actually prefer the alternative title, which is Governance, the Forgotten Cloud Killer. Why? Why is governance a cloud killer? Well, it's not so much that governance itself is a cloud killer, but the absence of governance can be a cloud killer. I talk to organisations all the time, and when I'm asked to help and advise around how a team can look at using Azure for a particular business problem, system solution, application architecture, there are a set of red flag conversations that come up more often than you'd necessarily expect. So you get comments like, well, we decided to do this in the cloud because we're a business team and our IT guys just don't have time to get involved in the project. So because they have no time, we decided to use cloud and we're going to go around it. Yeah, we'll come back to why that's a bad idea later on. Or alternatively, we get, well, we know that this cloud thing is important. We know we're going to have to tackle the big issues, but right now we don't need to. This is all about getting something in quick from a standing start. We want to build a prototype, we want to prove the use case, and once we've done that, as we move into production, then we'll worry about governance. Arguably, that could be even worse, and we'll talk about why that might be in a moment too. Or, and this really happens a lot, so we're new to cloud. We're the first guys in. We're looking for this development team, as they build this solution, to explore the capabilities and the issues, bounce off the branches as they fall out of the tree occasionally as they're working on this project. And one of the deliverables for this proof of concept is for this development team to work out as they go what we might need to do in terms of regulation or compliance. Now, ironically, that one is not necessarily a bad play so long as you've got things like governance in mind. Why? Why is governance important? Why do we need to think about it up front rather than as a bolt-on at the end? Well, there are lots of things that can go wrong. We've got our beautifully architected, wonderfully implemented, all singing, all dancing, PaaS, serverless, you name it, the buzzwords are in there, all the latest and greatest technologies. We've used preview services, we've used services that are right new out of the gate, and it's absolutely fantastic. And we deploy it, and then after a few days, the alarm bells start ringing. Now the problem is, the alarm bells start ringing not because the dev team have done anything wrong. It could be the most expertly written code. It could be an absolutely brilliant architecture. It could meet the business requirements absolutely perfectly and be delivering value from day one, but still have problems. And what those problems might look like take a number of different forms. The obvious first one is that we deploy our solution into production, and suddenly we discover that this is costing way more than we expected. And we're really not sure why that is. We did testing, sure, we did some sums early on as to how much the different services cost, but as we've got load on this thing, the bills are going up and we just don't know why. We can't work out what's costing so much. Or maybe we've deployed all of our services and then we suddenly realize that, oh heck, hang on, because we've used service X, and it wasn't available in the region that we're actually based in. So let's say, for the sake of argument, we've got to put stuff in the UK. We're a UK organisation. So we've used something that's in North Europe. It's Dublin. That's not far, right? That's okay. It's not in the UK though, is it? So if our data is now in Dublin, where does that leave us for regulatory compliance? We did some work a while back for an organisation who were looking at migrating their development platform from an on-premise hosted then Team Foundation server into the new wonderful cloud service that is now Azure DevOps. And we got quite a long way down the line of planning and looking at this before somebody realised that actually the source code that they were looking at moving into the cloud was covered by export regulations. And putting that source code into Azure DevOps, which at that point didn't exist in the UK, so it was going to Amsterdam, would contravene the export regulations that the software was given by. So fortunately, we caught that in time and nothing bad happened. But you can see the implication there that we need to be very, very careful that we know what data we're putting where, and maybe if a service isn't available in a region, then that's going to be an issue. And it's not just where we store our data that might be an issue. For the most part, people are okay with how data transits through different regions. But if we're absolutely concerned about that, maybe there are other components of our architecture that we just shouldn't be using because they're not available in the region that we have to deploy to. Now, had we seen that up front, we would have said, okay, part of our governance is our entire service has to be hosted in one of the UK data centers of Azure. Therefore, you are restricted when you do your architecture to the following smorgasbord of services, because those are the only ones that are available in the UK. Taking that a step further, we might want to consider maybe we used a preview service. Absolutely fantastic service. 6 months down the line, because it was in preview, actually it doesn't quite do what Microsoft were hoping, not many people are using it, it's going to be deprecated. Well, that's a problem because it's a cornerstone of our architecture. Heck, didn't think about that one. Do we need to consider that? Also a common one is we've deployed everything into production and now the accountants, the finance guys come and say, brilliant, you've done a really good job guys, but there's only one slight problem. We cross-charge in this organisation and you've managed to deploy things where we're not really sure who needs to pay what for what service. So that's going to be a problem because it's all going to come out of your budget now guys. If we can't think about how we can break down the costs of our services and how we can then associate those with the cost centers within the business, how are we going to tell whether those services are driving value for the appropriate areas? How are we going to charge back? It's even worse if we're providing services to customers outside the organisation. We need to think about billing. We might also need to think about how we track what's been going on in our application. So we've deployed this thing, it's absolutely brilliant, but nobody knows who's changed what, when they changed it, and suddenly if something breaks, we can't backtrack to work out what our audit trail was to see what it was we did that affected the system. Or worse still, there's no audit trail on things like remote management or data access, so we can't tell if somebody's accessing the data that's stored in the system that we've already established is quite critical and governed by compliance regulations and all manner of maybe industry regulations. So if we can't say who's accessed it what and when, we're in breach. That's a significant issue. What if the data that we can't tell if we're accessing isn't encrypted? Is that because we didn't flick the appropriate switch on the service? Is it because the service doesn't offer encryption of data at rest? Now, virtually every Azure service provides encryption at rest these days, and many of them actually support things like bring your own keys. But some of them you do have to turn it on, especially if you want to use your own encryption keys. If we're using communication between services, are we properly securing those? Where are we storing the certificates? Are we using things like Key Vault for services? Many of these things that I've been talking about are architectural implementation facing issues. But if we had effective governance in place before we started down the journey, we would have known which fork in the road to take at our different decision points. because we might have said, well, that service isn't available in the UK, or that service doesn't involve encryption that we need, or that service doesn't hasn't exited preview yet, so we're not absolutely sure about its future. And we have to include certain services for auditing and tracking what's going on in the application. That segues quite nicely onto what do we need to think about in terms of the areas of governance. And these might not need to be, great thick documents of detail. It's just a series of headlines in a wiki maybe that we flesh out as we go, that we put down the core things that might bite us as an organisation that we know we need to look at and manage and control as we move into this new cloud beastie. So the first and most obvious of those is technology governance. I've touched on this already. So, we should be thinking about what services we are going to allow ourselves to use. Now, there may be numerous reasons why we want to pick what we do to go onto our subset, our menu, which is a distillation of the overall Azure smorgasbord. But I always think that there should be a set of key questions that you ask. Maybe we need to consider a service as being off limits because where it stores our data. Maybe we actually need to keep some of our data on premise, and if services can't access data on premise, then that's not going to work. Maybe we do need to think about what regions they're storing it in. Maybe we need to think about a little bit broader, not just in terms of where it's stored, but how it's stored, how our data is managed. Can we get replication for resilience? Can we get replication at the level that we need between data centers, perhaps, because we want to make sure that there's no risk of data loss? And what is the story about accessing those backups or replicas of data? Maybe there are some tick marks missing from that we're not happy about. We've already mentioned about how we deal with that data. So if I'm using a cognitive services API, for example, maybe I'm doing speech to text. What about the information that I'm pushing into that API might concern me? To give you an example, we work with a police forces in the UK, and the potential of some information being used to train the AI and being siphoned off by Microsoft is an issue if we're dealing with, say, I don't know, an interview from a witness or something that might be used in court that is critically important and highly sensitive. If we can control whether Microsoft can access our data for training purposes, that's fine. And I should say that these days with a lot of the upcoming services, you can indeed start to do things like that. But you must check first. Because if I can't guarantee that data is only ever in the region that I tell it to be in and used by the services that I tell it to be used by in the manner which I know and expect it to be used, there's a big red flag there. Because I'm responsible for that data and I don't know where it's going and I don't know how it's being used. And it might have gone somewhere that's suddenly outside that jurisdictional boundary. You might also choose to exclude certain services, at least initially for your first few projects, simply because of how skilled you are in using them. So I visit lots and lots of customers. Virtually every organization that I visit has .NET developers, and they're absolutely comfortable working with websites or web services written in .NET. So that's probably a really big tick for Azure App Services. Now, as an alternative, depending on our architecture, we might say, hey, you know what? Service Fabric looks like the bee's knees. Really fantastic solution. Gives us a lot of help around how we deploy, how we version, the resilience, the data management. You know what? We've got absolutely no skills in that. Now that's not to say that ultimately Service Fabric should not enter your menu of available services, but just maybe as you set out on the journey, you've got so many plates to spin, so many balls to juggle. Focus on the things that you know and you have good skills in-house with, because that removes so much business risk. And then, as you're comfortable and you know that you can deploy to cloud and manage in cloud and function in cloud, then as you rev your application, there's a migration path for you there to use some of the newer, more innovative services. That might also relate to, what do you already do? I spend quite a large amount of time working with organisations who have box products. You know, for the past 1100 years, they have been doing a new CD every 6 months, 12 months or so, and they ship it to their customers, and their customers install it on their tin in their data centre. And now the customers are saying, well, you know, we don't really want to do that anymore. We're shifting our service model. We're looking at software as a service. We've already moved to Office 365. We've already moved some of our internal stuff to other cloud-hosted services. We think you're going to be next. We don't want to host this anymore. We want you to. And those organizations go, ooh, right, heck, we need to build a SaaS model. Right, what are we going to do? And for those organizations, I always say that their first journey to the cloud should be sticking to what they know. Don't massively re-architect. Don't completely rebuild on a new technology platform, because you've got enough to worry about as you move to this new commercial model and hosting model and data responsibility model. So either that might be an appropriate use of IaaS in the short term, if your customers can allow you to be a bit flexible with what you're going to charge for the service to cover the generally more expensive level of cost you're going to get with IaaS. Or maybe it's that we do exactly what I said a few minutes ago. We take the websites that are in this application and we move them into app services. We take the Windows services and we run them as continuous running web jobs. We take our SQL server and we run it as Azure SQL. There's still work to do around the edges there to think about security and communication and how we're going to modify those services to function in the cloud world. But we can stand upon the breadth and depth of knowledge that we already have as a team and focus on the important aspects of the cloud migration rather than getting bogged down in completely rebuilding our app. So once we've decided what services we're going to be allowed to use, that then has a direct relationship with where we're allowed to use them. And these are going to influence each other. We need to know what of the 40 some, nearly 50 now, Azure regions we're going to be able to use. And this might not be the obvious one. So I might be a UK-based company, but my customers may not be in the UK. So I might need to think about which Azure regions I'm going to need to deploy to ultimately for production. Give you a good example of that, we did some work with an organisation a while back, based in the UK. We're looking at moving their solution to Azure hosted, but needed to be very careful because they were very clear that actually one of the things they wanted to get out of an Azure migration was a reduced setup time and importantly also a reduced exit time, so they could enter a market, test it, and if it didn't really work they could collapse the whole solution without having to be mindful of a multi-year hosting contract, or they bought a load of expensive tin that they couldn't get rid of. But that meant that they had a hit list, if you like, of target markets. And as a result of that, we had to look very carefully at what the regions were. Were those regions actually managed by Microsoft or not? Some aren't. So the Chinese data centers, for example, are third-party managed. The German data centers were. They're currently being replaced with a new set that are Microsoft managed. Or other things might influence. So I believe it's still the case that if you want to deploy into the Australian data centers, because of Australian tax law, you have to be a registered Aussie company. So if we want to go after the Australian market, maybe we need an Aussie subsidiary out there first. Or if we can't have one of those, then that precludes the Australia regions. We might also need to consider whereabouts our customers are storing their data. So If our customers are in Europe, even though I'm a UK organisation, I may need to deploy to West Europe or North Europe, or some of the other upcoming Azure regions, depending on who my customers within Europe are. If my customers are in the UK, I need to have that conversation with them to say, well, are you okay in Europe, or are you, absolutely steadfastly focused on the UK? And there are some organisations, public and private sector, that say no, because of our compliance requirements, we have to put our data in a UK data centre. And finally, then again, how do our customers need to store that data? Are there services that are not available in some of the data centres within their acceptable regions that focus down on where we're going to put these things? The reason this is really important to do up front and have a look at up front is because the last thing you want to do is build this glorious Carlos Fandango service, get your first customer, and discover that you cannot actually onboard them because you can't put the services where they need them to be because of where their data has to go, and everything screeches to a halt. Then we have the one that I hope is blindingly obvious, but is perhaps a little bit more in-depth than you might necessarily think about. And that's security governance. How are we controlling access, not just to the application that we've built with these services, but to those services themselves? Because we're going to need to access data, and we're going to probably need to audit accessing that data if we are accessing customer data. So that's not in terms of restricting how the users access their information inside our application. It's how we, as the people that operate the application, might access that data. Do we need to lock ourselves off from it completely? Do we have to comply in terms of how we manage our applications with specific processes because our customer mandates them? I know some organisations who've built cloud-hosted services have had to look very carefully at how they remotely manage these services and implement things like junk boxes, implement just-in-time administration, multi-factor authentication, not necessarily because their own internal security processes mandated it. That's not to say any of those are a bad thing, but because their customers or the compliance frameworks with which their customers are working mandate those things. And we as a supplier have to be able to tick a box and prove that we've got all the right processes in place and all the right audit trails in place. And some of that auditing is really important. And we're back to what kind of information are we storing at this point. So application insights and log analytics are absolutely fantastic tools. They're brilliant and you should absolutely turn them on. But you need to think about what these telemetry services are capturing. And then temper that with where are these telemetry services storing that information that they're capturing. So just recently, log analytics has rolled out in the UK. That's great for us because we have an application that we'd really like to use the telemetry and logging services with. But again, because of very valid customer concerns with the people that we're working with, I said, no, hang on, we don't want any possibility of things like stack traces or information that you might throw in an exception that's perfectly valid to display in a Windows event log or a system log on the machines that we're running and managing. We don't want you throwing that up in the cloud because the information that's in that stack trace is governed by exactly the same compliance mechanisms as the data itself in the database, because frankly it is that data. If there's the potential of showing customer data or a credit card number or anything like that in the logging that you're outputting, maybe you can't use log analytics or app insights because it's not available in the region that you need to deploy your application, and you need that logging local to the app. Something you need to think about very carefully when you look at and consider how you're going to build telemetry into your application. We also need to think about identity and access control. We need to think about how we restrict access to the Azure subscriptions that we're deploying our applications to. Now, we should think about having more than one subscription. If for no other reason, then there are dev test subscription types and production subscription types that have different SLAs, but importantly, different costs. And dev test is cheaper. So we ought to have isolated subscriptions that the dev teams can use that perhaps the dev teams have got more administrative access to because they need to turn services on and off, and they need to be able to experiment with new technologies. Now, that's not to say that those subscriptions shouldn't be audited and controlled, but they may be slightly looser than the access control we have in our production subscription. Perhaps that production subscription has rights restricted such that only our CI/CD platform is able to create and deploy services. And once those are deployed, we use the role-based access control that's available inside Azure, and we use the various security boundaries and security inheritance that's given to us by subscriptions and resource groups and services to limit the access to just our support personnel. And maybe we need to go a little further than that. Maybe we need to think about using some of the privileged identity management, the just-in-time administration functions that are available in Azure AD, so that I might be a valid support officer, but I can't actually access the services without going through an approval process where I request access and my manager says, yeah, it's okay, Rick, I can see that you're working on this for customer X, I'm going to approve that, at which point I'm dropped into the appropriate Azure AD group, which grants me the admin rights to that service. And maybe we go further than that. Maybe that access is timed. Maybe I only get 60 minutes, 90 minutes, a couple of hours, and at the end of that, my access is revoked, and I have to repeat that process. All of those should be audited. Why is that important? Well, people leave and join our organisation. How we manage those user accounts is critical. It's absolutely possible to have an Azure subscription linked to a live ID. And if you're an organisation, that's insane, and you should back away now from doing that. And if you have done that, I don't want to know, look over there. Why? Well, because a live ID is not owned by the organisation. My live ID is mine. If I leave Black Marble, my live ID goes with me. And unless there is solid documentation of where that live ID has been used within my organization's services and to what things like Azure subscriptions that live ID has been granted access, and what Azure ADs that live ID is a guest user in, I leave and I continue to have access as though I'd never left, and suddenly I'm a massive potential security breach, because obviously I look shifty and I wouldn't trust me as far as you could throw me, would you? That's really important. So if nothing else, you should have some governance that says we do not use live IDs. Live IDs will not get access to any of our services. The same is true maybe if we're working with partner organizations. Wouldn't it be better if we made our partner organizations manage their user accounts and they have their own Azure AD, and then we pull those user accounts into our services using the Azure AD guest approach? That means that authentication happens with the partner org and authorization happens with me. When my associate leaves the partner org, their account is disabled by that partner org, at which point all of their access to both the partner org systems and my systems ceases immediately. Again, de-risking to me what that person can access. And maybe while they were working for the partner org, it was totally valid for them to have access. You know, they were doing co-administration. Maybe we'd outsource something. Maybe they were a developer. You know, who knows? Maybe they were an expensive, cute consultant with long hair. All of these things are important. So security is a really good thing to have at the back of your mind. When we're deploying services, how are we going to restrict access to those services? How are we going to manage security within our application and without our application? And how are we going to audit and ensure that we can demonstrate that not only have we implemented that security, but we can also prove that the boundaries that we've set up have been observed and the behavior that we are trying to legislate for has been followed and that we can get alerts and whatever else if those boundaries are crossed. Then, arguably most important for one significant sector of the business, we need to think about purchasing governance. Now, by this I mean, how are we going to purchase our Azure services? And some of this comes down to how large an organization we are. But let me put it this way. You don't really ever want to run your commercial services on a pay-as-you-go subscription. Having it wired into a credit card is a very, very potentially bad thing. I've worked with organizations where their production services have been wired up to the personal credit card of somebody who's then left. I've worked with organizations where it's been wired up to the company credit card of somebody who's still with the organization, but who suddenly had a very unexpected large bill one month, and the Azure payment bounces. And then you have the whole, oh, hang on, where are the emails going? Do we know that the payment bounces? How do we deal with that? So you need to think about how you purchase Azure. And there are several different ways of doing that. Maybe it's a CSP, the cloud solution provider. Maybe it's an enterprise agreement. The way that you should determine and decide how best to purchase Azure is by asking yourselves a set of questions about how you operate and how large you are, to be honest. It's how do you want to manage the subscriptions that you've got? Do you want to have cost centers within your business that you can easily associate different Azure subscriptions with for charging purposes? Do you need a structure, a hierarchy of management and control? How do you work as an organization? Do you acquire and sell parts of your organization so you actually need to keep the purchasing of Azure completely separate? Or do you need totally centralized billing? Do you need to be easily able to establish costs to bill your customers? So you need to very carefully separate the services for customer A for the services for customer B. And another interesting one, what about if a customer leaves your service and you need to pass their data back to them? It's a conversation that comes up an awful lot. You know, I'm taking your services, that's absolutely brilliant. Can you demonstrate to me how you will destroy my data to my satisfaction when I leave your service? One of the nice things that you can do with Azure is you can actually, through the magnificent support team, you can change the association that subscription has in terms of ownership. So I know several organizations whose attitude to customer data is, you know what, we do not delete your data. If you leave our service, your application components are deployed in a single Azure subscription. We will remove those components, we will leave your data, and we will transfer the subscription to you. At which point, I no longer have your data, and you're responsible for the secure deletion of that data in line with your policies and being compliant with whatever regulations that you need to be. So this is important because how you purchase Azure is something that you should at the very least consider before you start. This is not the point where you want a gung-ho department head to go out with a credit card and just buy an Azure subscription, and all of the development and test and then production is all done in one subscription, and there's no way to tell things apart, and there's no process and no demarcation, and then you go, heck, how are we going to deal with that? Yes, there are migration paths, but it's a lot easier to bolt the door before the horse is in the stables, and especially if we built the stables with doors in the first place. So you should definitely think about how you purchase Azure, and then think about how you're going to do that separation of subscriptions, Azure AD's identity, all of that kind of stuff. Which leads me to implementation. So we've established a set of ground rules. We've got a beautifully written wiki. It's got headings, they're really great headings. You know, we've got a nice set of fonts and colours in there. Absolutely beautiful, lays down the rules that we're going to follow. Brilliant. How are we going to ensure that those rules are followed? How are we going to actually implement our governance in production? How are we going to ensure and prove that what we've written as the guiding light of how we're going to use Azure is actually how we're going to use Azure? And the answer to that is the platform itself brings a whole bunch of Lego bricks that you can use to help you constrain and control how you're using the platform to make sure you're doing it in line with what you've prescribed as your governance. So, for example, just starting really simply, maybe we want to put a resource naming convention in place. Naming resources in Azure is always interesting because it's a bit like the service guys had a bunch of dice, you know. So what naming convention are we going to use? Okay, so we'll roll for service length, or D20. We'll roll for uppercase, lowercase. We might allow special characters, hyphens, ooh, don't know. So it can be really hard to tell what services are associated with what application. And maybe what we should actually be doing is saying, you know what, we're going to put a standard in place. And we've got to work with the lowest common denominator, so there's going to be a maximum length, which is the shortest of the services. We'll take out special characters, and within that naming convention, we want to know whether it's dev, test, or production. Maybe what region it's deployed to. Yes, we can look at the service and see what region it's deployed to, but actually sometimes at a glance, if my service is called Europrod App 1, well, I know it's my App 1 service and it's in Europe and it's a production service. App 1's probably a bad name. Let's think about how we're going to separate out. Are we going to go by service components? Are we going to say it's a website? Do we need a unique app name to try and collect things together? If you can do that, you can see at a glance then all of the different services that go together. Then we need to think about how we're going to group our resources. And there are lots of different valid approaches for this. Do we want to put all of the resources for a given application in one single resource group? Now, there are significant benefits to that, not least in the way that if I wanted to remove an application, I just delete the resource group. And magically, the Azure Pixies will just take everything from that resource group and burn it to the ground for me, and I don't need to worry about have I left anything behind. The flip side of that is, well, that's okay, but what if we've got an architecture where we've got shared components? It's not really appropriate. We don't want to put everything in one resource group because we might have different instances for different customers. So maybe we need to think about collecting resources by several resource groups with a convention how we're going to do that. Perhaps, as I've mentioned before, for ease of billing or ease of transitioning services to our customers, we want to put everything for a given customer in one subscription. Maybe we're a large organization and actually what we would like to do is have a subscription per application. Maybe our applications actually aren't that small. Maybe they're quite complicated, you know, beasts with lots of moving parts. Maybe it would be good for us to have a subscription for our expenses app and a subscription for our timesheets app and a subscription for our, I don't know, holiday booking app. That's perfectly valid. Another thing that you should absolutely take advantage of is something in Azure called resource tags. So when you deploy anything at all in Azure, you can tag it. And that's really important because that means you can start putting metadata on your services. And now with the Azure Resource Graph, we can start to look at and explore and pivot our view of those resources using those tags. So for example, one of the things that we do quite a lot here at BM is when we deploy something, we tag the resources with the version number of the build that's been released through our CI/CD process. We tag whether it's a dev environment or a test environment or a prod environment. We might tag it with a product name or a project name or a customer name. All of these things then can ripple through into reporting and cost management reporting, particularly if you've got an enterprise agreement where I can start saying, show me all of the resources that are tagged with customer A so that I might use that for my billing purposes really quickly and really easily generate customer-specific billing. Identity management, role-based access control, absolutely critical, and you should totally think about using Azure AD Groups for how you collect your staff members, your user together, and grant permissions to those Azure AD Groups. Don't grant permissions directly to a person. Similarly, there are lots and lots of roles inside Azure, but you can also define your own custom roles. So if you're an organization that's very concerned about security, think about maybe not using the default contributor owner type roles, create your own. Grant the permissions in a very granular fashion, document those permissions, and then associate the role with an Azure AD group so you've got an absolute pass-through, and you know that if a new starter arrives that you can drop them in one group and their access is appropriate, and if they move through the organization their access will change as you move them through those groups. So, I've got about 5 minutes left. I've talked about the different areas of governance. I've talked about some of the things that you can do, should do to implement governance. Let's just talk very briefly about the fact that Azure does actually have some of its own Lego bricks to help you with governance. And why is automation of governance useful? Well, it's this age-old image of speed versus control. Business needs agility, it needs flexibility, it wants to respond quickly to changes in market and business needs. IT doesn't want that. IT needs stability, it wants access controls, it wants rules, because change implies risk and agility implies risk, and IT is risk averse. When it comes to Azure, the aim is to give you a set of services that you can use, that your Cloud Center of Excellence, that your cloud admins can deploy to help the rest of the organizations be good citizens. So Azure policies allow us to write simple rules that are checked every time we deploy a resource. So we can enable and disable certain regions. We can block or we can audit. And in some circumstances, we can also remediate. So we can say, you know what, if there's no key vault in this subscription, create one. Azure Blueprints allows us to take those policies, combine them with role-based access control and security, and deploy them en masse as a version-controlled, stamped entity to different subscriptions. And we can combine that with management groups to give us a hierarchy of subscriptions, which ultimately we should be able to apply blueprints to management groups, and any of the subscriptions that are inside those will inherit the subscriptions. That will inherit the blueprints, sorry. Not there yet, but that's the direction of travel they're going. And then finally we combine that with cost management. Started as an EA service. Again, it's going to be rolling out across Azure as they improve and develop it. This allows me to start putting budgets on subscriptions. It allows me to start putting alerts if we pass certain cost levels on resource groups or subscriptions. It allows me to get really, really great cost analytics and cost reporting for those subscriptions. So even while I'm developing or while I'm running, I can see how much things are costing. And I might even be able to see projected costs. And I can do things like put a budget on. So I can say, you know what, dev team, you've got 30 grand for the month. And if they burn the 30 grand in a week, I get an email and I go, hang on. Right. I'm going to wrap up slowly. I just want to say thanks for your time. I've talked about an awful lot. I've tried not to be terribly technical. This isn't a session for a technical audience. This is a session for all of you to think about how you're managing your Azure subscriptions and your Azure consumption. There's an awful lot of great information on the web provided by Microsoft that you should go and have a look at to kickstart how you're dealing with governance for your use of cloud. And if you go to aka.ms/governance docs, that will take you to the governance section of the docs.microsoft.com website. And I absolutely urge you to look at that. So, as we close, I'd just like to say thank you very much for watching. You have been watching Rick Hepworth. I'm the Chief Consultancy Officer at Black Marble. I'm also an Azure MVP, which means that I get the great privilege of participating in events like this and advocating the use of Azure and Microsoft technologies to an audience like you. And at that point, I will say thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this marvelous global online Azure Bootcamp.